This conference will now be recorded.
All right, next thing to do, remember how to share my screen here. All right, so that should have changed. And you should be now looking at the screen that talks about issues in the Book of Mormon. And now we can get on to the first. At the beginning, what I'm interested in talking about, I guess I can't move that screen. What I want to do before we get into any of the specifics is to talk about sort of the base information about how to approach the kinds of questions that we're looking at. So what kind of principles do we use? If we're looking at any kind of issue that deals with history or historicity, how are we going to do that? For example, one of the ways that some people would look at history or historicity is to say, if you have faith, nothing else matters. And that's perfectly fine for people who have faith and for whom nothing else matters, but that's not what we're going to be talking about. What we're interested in is something a little bit more solid than that. And there we go. Well, back up. Okay. Even though we're not beginning with saying, I've got faith and therefore it happens, it's still important to realize that in asking all of these questions, I do begin with a faithful assumption that the Book of Mormon is what it says it is. And what we're doing is testing that hypothesis. It is entirely possible for people to find what they're looking for. And I've seen a lot of that happen where somebody says, look, I want to, prove that all of my examples are coming up political. I'm going to try to avoid that. But if I started with the premise that the Book of Mormon is not historical, then everything that I look at is going to be finding ways to demonstrate whether that it is not historical without asking the question. So unless I begin with the supposition that it is possible that it is an ancient record, then I have no real way to test whether or not it's an ancient record, because I would have already made up my mind and thrown out anything else that would be a contrary position. So the first thing that we're going to look at, we begin with a faithful perspective. I've been doing that perspective on the Book of Mormon pretty intensely for, I'd say, 20 years, and I have yet found a reason to move away from the premise that the Book of Mormon is an authentic representation of an authentic ancient document. Now, how it represents that is part of what we're going to be talking about. Next thing is, if we're going to talk about the Book of Mormon as something that is historical, one of the things that we need to do is to understand that human beings wrote the text. So regardless of what we think about Revelation, there is no indication anywhere in the Book of Mormon that the people who wrote it were receiving revelation from God on every single word to put down. There will be times when they said, God told me, and we'll get a phrase, but we never get any indication that there's anything other than a human being who is looking at this. And the two that I've looked at most intensely are Nephi and Mormon. And for both of them, you can tell that they have things in their mind that are based on who they are, what their experiences are, that are dictating the way that they are writing, and they're doing it differently from each other. But they're human. And so I have had in the past in a couple of discussion groups, at times when somebody has said, oh, well, that's not the way I read the Book of Mormon, and that's perfectly fine. But they usually get really unhappy if I say, oh, here's where Mormon made a mistake, or here's where Nephi, made an error. Because it's scripture, people don't want to think that there's an error. That's kind of a remnant of the sort of, the old religious idea that this is a God-breathed text, and what we have with the Bible is exactly what God wants us to have. The more we study the Bible, the more we realize that it is, although inspired, it has come through human beings, and we need to understand it that way. Book of Mormon is going to be the same thing. It is going to come through human beings. And we need to understand that it should operate according to typical rules for how human beings will create their records. There shouldn't be anything absolutely unusual about this. It should fall into human experience. Okay, next. Because we think a human being has written this, we can also use our human sciences and understanding to approach the text and examine not only what it says, but what it implies. Every text has a context in which it was written. And for most authentic texts, they don't explicitly tell you their context. They'll give you hints. But the more they tell you about it, the more you know that it is an artificial construct. Now, let me give you an example of that. If you have read any science fiction, world building, fantasy, you know that the authors have to spend a fair amount of time building that world so that you know how it operates. And there's going to be descriptions of things. And particularly if you have, unusual buildings or any kind of thing that's different, they'll spend time talking about that because part of the world that you're entering, that this author is creating for you, is one that is not part of your experience. And so you have to describe it a lot. If you are dealing with somebody who is writing a letter to a friend and they happen to say, the other day I went to the store, you're not going to get a definition of what size store it was, where the door was, whether or not the door opened automatically or they had to push it. You're not going to get descriptions about whether or not you walked, rode a bicycle, took a car. None of those things are relevant because we all understand those basic concepts as a background. And so with all of that, a real authentic text just doesn't tell you that much. And the more it tells you, the more that you know that this is fiction. One of the things that if you ever get bored enough that you want to do it, there is a copy available of the Spalding manuscript, the manuscript found. And if you read through that, one of the things that you will notice is there is a lot of descriptive language. There are a lot of times when the author is describing what's happened. You just don't find that very much in the Book of Mormon. You don't get descriptions because they were part of the shared experience and nobody needed to do them. Now we got a comment here. Let me look. Have to look at individuals as separate humans with their own tendencies. Absolutely. And again, the two I have spent more time with are Nephi and Mormon. They're extremely different. Their styles are different. The way they use scripture is different. The type of explanation they use, the purpose for which they wrote, the organizational structure that they're using, all of that is very different for those two men. And so you really do, because we're dealing with the Book of Mormon, you really have to look at not only what the text says that the people are, but whether or not we can discern that there are different individuals. Again, if we're looking at questions of historicity, if we would see that there is a uniform voice throughout the entire Book of Mormon, then you've got a uniform author. Now, having said that, one of the things we'll be looking at for most of the time today is translation. And just as a hint, I think there is strong evidence that there was only one translator. The nature of the English language, the way it's put together, the structures of the sentence do not vary between what we call the small plates and the large plates. It's the same language in English. It's the same method of constructing sentences. So you can pull back and say, well, this is how Nephi constructs things. But when you get to the English translation, that's pretty consistent. And then you look at it and you say, okay, yeah, there was a translator and only one. Okay. The last one that I wanted to say as part of kind of background for where we're going to go is that what we really have to do is look at the entirety of the text. what I have seen so many people do when they are trying to either prove or disprove the Book of Mormon, and it happens in both ways, is they will focus on something. And you'll say, oh, I have this great explanation for this. And because I can explain this, that must explain the Book of Mormon. And all of a sudden, there's something over here where it says, it doesn't explain that. And so if you don't look at the entire context of the Book of Mormon, if you look at it too narrow of a focus, you're not going to understand it. You're putting your own interpretation and imposing it onto the text rather than find something that supports it. The other thing that's a corollary to that, we will find any number of things where we say, okay, this is an explanation for such, such, and such. And then you'll find contrary evidence. And in the sciences, it is not unusual at all to have experiments run where most of things are working well, but you'll find some exceptions. You'll find negative data. You'll find contrary data. And either the contrary data will negate what you're looking at, or it will simply mean that you have to come up with a reason why that fits into that whole schema that will describe the reason why you have the negative data. So negative data, you have to acknowledge it. You have to understand that it's there. If you don't, you're again looking at too narrow of a focus on the Book of Mormon. All right, so that's the foundation. Those are the basic principles we're going to have as we go through some of these issues. One of the other things that I have not mentioned and clearly should, if you have a question that you would like answered and I'm not covering it, or you don't know whether I'm going to cover it in the future, please send it to me in email. I'd love to have questions where I'm responding to things that you're interested in rather than just saying, by the way, this interests me, so I hope it interests you. But today you get what interests me. Okay, what I want to spend the rest of the time on is talking about issues related to the translation of the Book of Mormon. If I am going to say that the Book of Mormon is based on a Nephite record, I am also saying that the English of that text is a translation of and somehow represents what the Nephites wrote, and it represents it in English. At the time the Book of Mormon was written, whether you talk Nephi or whether you talk Mormon, doesn't make any difference. The language we are speaking did not exist. So they did not do the plates in English. And when we see English, you got to know that it was a translation because it wasn't what was there originally. So we have to ask a question of what is the nature of the translation? What can we say about it? And the reason I want to start with this is that if we do not look at translation and have a firm grasp on the way we understand translation, then it's going to make a mess of everything that we do from there on, because it's too easy to go back and forth and say, oh, well, I like this piece of evidence because that works really well, but only if you use this philosophy of translation. And over here, here's something else, but that only works well if you use this version of translation. We have to be consistent. So the question is, what do we do? What do we talk about? If you've looked at any of the information that we have on the translation of the Book of Mormon, you end up listening to, knowing about what Royal Skousen said and his schema for the options that are available. And I'm going to suggest different ones because I think his were too limited in certain contexts. Anyway, but those are the ones that people know. And so we all know tight and loose. And then he had a third one, which is called ironclad. No one ever talks about ironclad because it's pretty easy to dismiss, and Skousen dismissed it easily. The ironclad is the one that says what we have is exactly what God wanted on the plates, and there are no mistakes. And it goes back to the time when we had witnesses to the translation that would say, and they could not make a mistake. The translation was perfect. If it wasn't exactly right, they could not write it down. Those are explanations that they created after the fact, and every one of them, well, at least the majority of them, will explicitly say, and it was marvelous. And that's the point. These are early believers. They know that this was a miracle, and so they want to make sure that everybody understands that it's a miracle and say, oh yeah, they were marvelous. This was perfect. This was great. Couldn't make a mistake. And then Skousen, in his very meticulous way, going through the text, finds mistakes, finds several places where the wrong word got written down and had to be created later. Found times when words got skipped or doubled up and they had to be corrected. And for those of you who remember what the whole process was, Joseph Smith would dictate and his scribes would write it down, and then they would say it's written, and they'd read it back to him, and then they'd go on. And you're going in maybe 20 words in a phrase to get this done. And it looks like at the sort of the outside limit, you're going to get maybe 20 words a minute between dictating it and getting it written down, read back, and go to the next. So you've got a minute's worth of time where you're spending on a block of 20 words, and then you've got to pick it up and go again. And that's research from Jack Welch, by the way, where he and his wife sat down and did that because he was curious. So the concept of ironclad is one that's pretty easy to dismiss. There's just too much evidence that it isn't ironclad. And so now we get tight and loose. And the general concept of tight and loose is tight means that it's really very, very close to what was on the Nephite record. And loose would be, well, it's kind of in general what that record meant. And when Skousen will talk about it, his loose is really pretty loose, which is the reason why I would do things a little differently than that, because it's kind of imprecise. If I were going to change, I would suggest, first of all, we don't have to worry about ironclad. You can leave tight because that has a very specific definition in the way Royal Skousen uses it. Royal Skousen says that Joseph Smith read text off of the seer stone and that he read what was written there and accurately dictated it to the scribe who wrote it down, and there may have been some error on the end of the scribe, and of course we can see where the scribe would make an error or two here and there. But the concept is the transmission from Joseph Smith, he saw it, read it, and presented it. And so for Skousen, his role for Joseph is not as a translator, but basically as a reader. And both he and Stanford Carmack have both proposed that Joseph Smith was not a translator, he was a reader. Now, rather than just this one category of a loose translation, I'd suggest two more. One is a functional translation. And in the examination I did of the text, I would say that if you're not sure what kind of translation it was probably a functional translation. What I mean by that is there are places in the text where I can guarantee you that what we have in English is not an accurate representation of what was on the plate text. And one of them that I was looking at just recently was talking about the image of being sorted as chaff and have sheaves brought to the threshing floor. And so that's language that's used. And when we hear they're brought in like sheaves to the threshing floor, or you're going to be separated like chaff, we're familiar with those images, even though we've never harvested wheat. We know enough of it that's in the background that these are images that are familiar to us. But they are absolutely related to agriculture with wheat, not corn, not sweet potatoes, any kind of potato. I'm trying to think of the multiple potatoes coming out of Peru, but we just didn't have wheat as a staple crop in the New World. And we didn't have it until we get people from the Old World coming over. So you know very well that what shows up as sheaves, threshing floor, these idioms that are giving us information to let us know something are translating a concept, but they are not translating the exact words. If they translated the exact words, we may not know what they were talking about. For example, a friend of mine who's Canadian and speaks French as well as English, talked about the problem of idioms, and one of them in French is mind your onions. If someone in English told me to mind my onions, I would have very little concept, unless I really knew the context. I'm not sure I know what that was. But it's basically the same thing as mind your business. And if we say to somebody in another language, mind your beeswax, they would wonder why we're talking about beeswax and not realize that it's a play on business. And there's just certain things that don't translate well. And translators in modern languages realize that what they have to do is come up with an equivalent that people will understand that will not be a literal representation of the words. Another one that I think is a really good example, if any of you, and most of you would have to go to a library, crazy people like me have it sitting on my shelves, but Alan Christensen did a translation of the Quiché Maya Popol Vuh. And he has a version of it that is in English and reads in sentences, and you can read it like you would expect to read one. He then has the Quiché text, but he also has a literal translation. And if you read through the literal translation and compare it to the translation that reads smoothly, you're looking at it and saying, wait a minute, how do these two even match up? How did he get this from that? Because he's translating concepts and meaning not the exact way the words were written, because their language communicates things in different ways than what English does. And so it comes out very differently. So in most cases, we have a functional definition. There's another comment here. Have I found Nephite idioms that have crept into the text? Not that I can identify. Everything that I see in English appears to be identifiable in English. When you get things in the text that I think I could assign to the Nephite text level rather than the translation level, it's going to be structures rather than vocabulary. So vocabulary is all going to be English, but the structures are going to be related to what was on the plates. And depending on, again, how many of these things we start looking at, structures will frequently survive translation. One of the structures is just simple parallelism. The Book of Mormon uses a lot of parallels. Hebrew certainly did. Quiché Maya does. There are chiasms in the text, and Quiché Maya has chiasms. So those things are structural at the text level. I haven't found anything that would be an idiom that survived into the English. Okay, now, let's see, I think I better move to another slide here. To give you an idea of the way Skousen looks at things, if we look at how text got from Nephite plates to our Book of Mormon, there are sort of factors that we could come up with. And one of them is to go from the Nephite record to a translator. And then, somehow the meaning that's on that text has to end up in the mind of the translator, and that person has to take that meaning and put it into English language. Then there is another role, which is there is a person who is dictating to the scribe. And the scribe is the one who is immediately in front of the manuscript. So the original manuscript being written down by a scribe. So there's two roles. There's translator, and then there's the transmitter. And in what Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack are saying is they're positing that Joseph Smith transmitted a text that someone else translated. Now, the problem with someone else translating is there is absolutely no indication of who that was. Their suggestion, of course, is that it has to do with this presence of early modern English, and we will talk about that. But they don't know who that person was. I have seen people suggest that it was Moroni himself, which is, interesting concept. He certainly knew what was on the plates, though why he couldn't learn Joseph Smith's idiom and had to do it in early modern English is something that's kind of difficult to understand. What I think happens, and the other one that I guess I should mention, once upon a time, what Brother Skousen and Brother Carmack would say is that it was a tight translation process. Nothing was loose, it was a tight translation. And then after some discussions with Stanford Carmack, he realized that there was this separation between the translator and the transmitter. And once that happened, we got to the point where all of us are now in agreement that going from the Nephite record to the translator, that process of getting it into English was more of a functional or conceptual mode of translation. And then again, what they would say is it was a tight transmission of that to Joseph Smith, who again, in a tight format, gave it to the scribe. Yeah, I guess we should talk about the evidence since we're talking about issues. So here's the discussion of the kind of evidence that we have. Step one, what evidence would Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack put forth to suggest that it was a tight translation? One of the first ones, before they came up with the early modern English information, was the names. And Royal said, this is the best information for tight because we can see there are times when Joseph said a name and the scribe wrote it down and then crossed it out and changed the spelling. So they spelled it phonetically at the beginning and then they had to spell it a different way. Coriantumr was the example. And I think Coriantumr was spelled Corintummer in the original and not with the MR as we see it. And so he said that change seems to indicate that Joseph was reading off the letters to make sure that the spelling was correct. Skousen does note that most of the time the earliest spellings have been controlled and seem to be the same. But the more you get into the text, the more things slip a little bit. And then he's found about 4 or 5 names where Oliver just plain made a mistake when he was translating or copying from the original onto the printer's manuscript, and he changed a letter in the name. For example, Kishkumen. We have it, I think we have it with a KU, and it was originally a CU. And then, of course, most famously, the difference between the Amalekites and the Amlicites. Skousen suggests that the word was originally pronounced with the emphasis on the first syllable, and so Amalekite would be Amalekite, and the other, where the C was pronounced hard, would be Amalekite, and they sounded close enough that eventually you reduced it, and then, of course, because it was a C there before the I, we changed it to an S and we got Amlicites. His suggestion, therefore, is that the Amalekites and the Amlicites are exactly the same people. It turns out that they are the same word, probably have the same meaning, but they are applied to 2 different people, and it's a long and complicated process to discern that. but there's a good paper in Interpreter that talks about why those two had to be separate. And I've gone through the issues, and I agree with the guy who wrote the paper. There are two different peoples that are both described with that term, Amalekite or Amalekite. Okay, so that's his evidence for tight. The next one, of course, is this early modern English. And if you haven't heard the arguments, and if you haven't heard them, you haven't been reading too much, because they're getting very, very popular, because it's another one of those, wow, we found this and we can't explain it, therefore it proves that Joseph Smith was a prophet. And everybody wants to find that thing, and they grab onto it, as hard as they can. It isn't as good as it sounds. Things that you need to know. Early modern English is a precursor to modern English. It's part of the same language. In linguistics, what happens is you tend to have, the further back you go in language, more variation. And the older a language is and the longer it's been around, the more regularized it becomes. So in early parts of the language, there's a lot of variation. And then as people speak the language and it becomes codified and narrowed down to this is right and this is wrong, there are things that get jettisoned. But if you go back to the documents of the earlier period, you will see them. And what they have done is they've gone back to the earlier period and they say, yes, these are what we find in the early period. But what happens is they're mistakes, and people tend to hang on to them, and not all language moves at the same rate in the same, in different places over time. That's how we get different dialects. That's how the word boot in American English and the word boot in Britain or British English have two different meanings, or could have. There's a boot of the car there, and here there's a trunk of a car. Vocabulary gets shifted around because there's a separation and time occurs. But we also get certain other kinds of things, and so we get spelling changes that occurred because the Americans wanted to clean up things that they had inherited. But in spite of all of that, what you will find is that mistakes will continue. And although we do not get as many ain't statements as we used to, certainly when I was younger, you would see a lot of people talking and they would say ain't a lot, and it's fading now. But ain't was a holdover from the earlier language where it was completely appropriate at one point in time. It was just a remnant of that. And so the fact that you have certain remnants that will show up later doesn't mean that you're reproducing the earlier language. It means that you're making the same mistake that they made, and now we identify that as a mistake rather than calling it normative grammar. So part of it is just the conception of where you are on that timeline. But the next part of the timeline that's a problem is that in order to decide that these were terms that were unique to the Book of Mormon and therefore reflective of something Joseph could not know, they would look to find out when they disappeared, and they would find that they, going through the electronic databases that are now available, they found that a lot of these things have disappeared, and maybe disappeared at the early 1700s, and but they're not finding them in Joseph's time, even though they show up in the Book of Mormon. Many of them do show up in Book of Mormon times, and when that was pointed out, Carmack's response was, well, not to the extent they are. And so again, the idea that everybody seems to think, which is that all of these things Joseph could not know, it's a question of quantity, not absolute difference. The other thing is, it also creates a problem with concepts of time, because they're searching through a database. You cannot find what isn't in the database, whether it existed or not. Secondly, we're talking Joseph Smith, who is speaking his own vernacular from his own education in upstate New York, which was not a highly literate society, even though they could read and write. They were not publishing their own books. But all of the evidence for the development of grammar is coming from printed books, which means you're now comparing apples and oranges, and you're saying because the oranges, the pit of an orange looks different from the pit of an apple, that they couldn't be both fruit. The next thing is the dating of all of these things, and they have found in running through these vocabulary items that there is one vocabulary item in the Book of Mormon that they couldn't find until after the time of the Book of Mormon. So in normal cases, what you tend to do is date a document based on its most recent information. They're not taking that step. They're going the other direction and dating it based on its earliest rather than its latest. And when you come up with something that says, well, there's something we can't find until after the Book of Mormon, it's entirely possible that God could reveal some word to Joseph that nobody was going to use until later. It's also possible that we just have an error in the way we're looking at the material, and I strongly suspect that's what it is. So when people ask me what I think about what Skousen and Carmack are doing, I believe their work is extremely good. When they describe the linguistics of all of this information, I'm sure it's completely accurate. It's the interpretation of it that is different. Okay. Now I've got a question here on which paper was that, but now I'm so far beyond it, I don't even remember which paper. So remind me and I'll send you an email of which paper it was. Here is what I think is happening. I think that what happens is that we get the Nephite record, and Joseph Smith is both the translator and transmitter that is then going to give that information in a reasonable, and I put conceptual loose, and I should have put tight for the transmission. I think once it came out of Joseph's mouth, I think the scribes are writing it down as well as they can. But the question is, how do we understand where that translation comes from? My understanding of that is based on the work that cognitive scientists are doing on the way we speak, on how you form speech. We all go through that, and we all know that as soon as we want to say something, we say it. But the scientists are interested in figuring out, what's behind that? How do we know what to say? How does the brain instruct us about the language that we use? And as with many things, we start to find what's underlying the things that we say when we make mistakes, when we say the wrong thing. And pretty much everybody has had the experience where we'll be speaking and we'll say something, and either the phrasing isn't what we intended, the meaning wasn't what we intended. And I've had it several times where I've said words that weren't the words that I thought I was going to say. And a word will come out, my wife will look at me and go, "What?" And I'll say it again. She's, "No, that's not what you said. Here's what you said." And I said that. A word came out that I did not know that I was going to speak. Another variation of that happened to me just recently, I was typing something and going through my head what I was going to type. So I'm thinking what the words are, and they are forming mentally. I'm hearing them in my mind before they're coming out, and this time not out the voice, but out of the fingers. And what happens is I had an option of two different sentences, and in my mind, I start to speak the other one, but my fingers typed the different one. So somewhere there was a meaning, and the meaning my fingers got was different from the one that I formulated to say. Basically, what Steven Pinker from Harvard says is that if we understand that we can say that wasn't what I meant, that means that we do have something that we mean prior to the time that that gets expressed in language. Now, what he called it was mentalese, and there's no reason not to use his term for it. And the concept of mentalese is simply the language of understanding prior to the language that we put it in. And after I wrote that in the book, some of the critics were, well, I'm just making things up, and Joseph just got these vague ideas, and that's not the way it works at all. Our mind does not come up with vague ideas. We come up with understanding, and then we express that understanding in vocabulary to which we have access. I have never spoken a word I did not know that made sense. I can come up with some gibberish here and there, but it has to be in my vocabulary before I can use it. I have to know something about my sentence structures before I can put them in. If I am trying to indicate, now I've lost my thread, you see? What I meant to say is what's coming up. The point of mentalese is that it is prior to language, it is prior to grammar, but it is specific. It's how we know something. Now, if you are familiar with more than one language, you have been a translator, and you have undoubtedly been in the situation where you understand before you come up with the words. Now, people who are truly bilingual, they may not even understand, they may flip a switch and they have no clue which language they're speaking. I had an experience like that when I was sitting in a bookstore in Guatemala, and these two wonderful women were sitting there having a conversation, both of whom were fluent in both English and Spanish. And as they're talking, something would happen and a word came up that was just better in the other language. And it would flip the switch, and both of them, without even thinking of it, now speaking the other language, it would just flip for both of them. And it would go along until something happened and it would flip back. And they're just having this conversation in two different languages, and it isn't even occurring to them that they're flipping back and forth all of the time. For those of us that aren't that good, we know what that process is before. And that process, that lag time between understanding and translating, is where mentalese comes in. And that's where we get what Joseph is doing. He had to understand what it was that he was trying to say before he would say it. Now, is there any indication that that's the way Joseph was translating? And I would say that there is. And the most interesting places that I've seen are places where we have incomplete sentences. There aren't that many, considering how many sentences there are and the fact that there are some very long and convoluted sentences. I've been going through a process where I took printer's manuscript and I decided to do what John Gilbert did and try to put punctuation and paragraphing into that manuscript just to see what it would be like. And going through that process, I've noticed that John Gilbert did a pretty darn good job. He was able to get most of the sentences. He and I would agree on, let's say, 80% of the sentences. He and I've got them exactly the same because you can tell where the sentence would have been. But there are some where you're getting an incomplete sentence. And it turns out that most of the incomplete sentences will be a sentence that starts with, let's say, having. And so, I, Alma, having done such and such for the Lord, who is the God Almighty and the, Father of heaven and earth and Father of the Son. And he goes on with these 5 or 6 titles. And by the time he's finished with all the titles, he forgot that he's got this hanging verb out there called having, where he's supposed to resolve that verb at the end of the sentence. And it just doesn't happen. And I think what happens in that case is Joseph has the understanding, he knows what he's trying to say, but he loses track in that process of 20. By the time it's now 2 minutes after he said having, he's forgotten that he had the word having, even though he knows what the sentence is supposed to say. And he'll get back in one of two ways. One, he'll just leave it dangling. And the other is sometimes he'll kind of start over. And you get what Skousen calls repetitive resumption, which is this sentence level where you've got off track, and in order to get back on track, you repeat the beginning. And so it'll be something like, and it came to pass that as I was, and you get all these things, and he loses track. And then at the end of the sentence, and as I was doing this, or it sometimes even came to pass as I was doing this. And they'll repeat that to say, okay, yeah, I'm getting back on track here. And I think those kinds of things are the kinds of things that you get when someone is speaking extemporaneously, when we are creating on the fly. It is not the type of thing that you get when you have written a document. And if any of you have ever written something and handed it to someone who is editing it, you know darn well that the editor is going to catch that and you're going to fix it. Either that, or if you've got it written down, you'll go back and go, oh, wait a minute, that sentence didn't work, let me fix it. But in the dictation process, we don't get that. So what I think is happening in the vast majority of cases is we have a functional understanding of what was on the Nephite plates. God gives to Joseph's mind that meaning when he needs it, and Joseph puts it into words, and the words he uses have access to his vocabulary, his memory, his syntax, and his associations. So we are, of course, going to get information from the King James Version because that's the Bible that Joseph knows. When there are times in the Book of Mormon where the text could be quoting an Old Testament scripture, and that Old Testament scripture is in the King James Version, but there's another version of the way it was used in the New Testament, invariably we'll get the language of the New Testament phrasing that meaning rather than the Old Testament. And I think that simply says Joseph recognized the meaning. He was more familiar with the New Testament language, and that's how it got encoded into his speech rather than as this direct translation process. Now, there are some caveats to all of that. There are places where I think there is a very tight, plausible connection between what was on the plates. Names seem to be the principal one, but not in the spelling, more in the meaning. And there are simply too many times when people who know the Hebrew have been able to go through the names and find out that the names that are being used fit the situation and the people. You see this all the time in the Old Testament. It's a very well attested way to use names. So it's perfectly logical that this would be a name that was created to have meaning, and they seem to have meaning. That would require some very close control over making sure that name was transmitted correctly so that we could get that meaning out of it. Most of it, of course, is functional. In conceptual, I think there are a few places where what we see in the translation is related to some, fulfilled prophecy that Joseph recognized. So when we see Isaiah 29 in Nephi's writing, it shows up very clearly reflecting the Martin Harris's experience with Charles Anthon and not being able to read the sealed book. Those read like fulfilled prophecy because they were, and Joseph recognized that, and so he wrote it that way. Prophecy from the Old Testament is never quite that clear. This one was clear because as Joseph is translating it, he recognizes the symbols and puts that information in as he recognizes it. The other one that I think is interesting is in Nephi's description of the events of the final, the coming of Christ and his death. He gives a description of the destruction. Now, in First Nephi, when he does that, this is after Joseph had already translated the rest of the Book of Mormon. So he's already gone through the descriptions in Third Nephi. So the ones that show up in First Nephi are very, very close to the ones that are in Third Nephi. And certainly the meaning in both of those is going to say, yeah, these are the words that are there. But because of the the formatting and how close they are, it's entirely possible that there was some bleed through of remembered meaning from 3rd Nephi that went in. There are a number of things where there simply isn't one. And I remember an article from years ago where there was a suggestion that the Christian concepts from the end of the Book of Mormon got put into the beginning, and that's not there. It doesn't work that way at all. But all of this is to say that if we're going to have a foundation on which to start to examine other kinds of things, we begin with concepts of translation, because that's going to influence what we can do. So, last one. What can translation explain? Well, we can explain why there are anachronistic flora and fauna. Oddly enough, there are good indications that we will be able to find pre-Columbian horses. I don't think that's even going to change for the Book of Mormon, because even when they find a horse, you don't find a horse doing horse things in the Book of Mormon. And so even if we find one, then we would have to explain why that horse never affected New World culture in the way that it did Old World culture. That's assuming that when it says it's a horse, it must be a horse. Or any of the other animals that aren't there, like lions and lambs and any number of things. Presence of 19th century phraseology. There are phrases in there that come out of the camp meetings. There are phrases that preachers used to describe, let's see, to sing the song of redeeming love was something that Joseph would have heard many times. What's it doing in the Book of Mormon? Well, not copying, but being primed. It was a term that he knew, a term that he understood. And because he knew it and understood it, that's how the recall came when you get that piece of memory. And of course, all of the King James Version. The next thing that it does, however, if we look at this kind of translation, you remember I said that the problem is you have to take the whole of the text. If you say that this is the way the text was translated, there are certain things that simply don't work, and one of them is Hebraisms. You have people who are saying that they're finding all of these Hebraisms in the text. Most of the ones that you find are easily modeled by the King James Version, so that doesn't mean that they're there. Some of the ones that I have seen being used as a Hebraism don't hold up in the text. The only way they could be there is to have a very tight connection between the two, and you can't find it. You can't find it consistently. And then, of course, any vocabulary related thing. The vocabulary is coming in from a modern source. Now, with that foundation of translation, now we can move on to some other things. And frankly, I haven't decided what we're doing next week, so I'll let you know when I know. All right, now, let's see if I can get my screen back here. All right, that covers what I wanted to cover for the evening. Questions that nobody's written down yet? Or unmute yourself and ask a question. Silence. We'll assume you're all silent because you're all muted. Otherwise, you'd be talking a lot. So,
Brant, I'll ask a question.
Yeah, please.
And I'm not quite sure how to articulate this. As someone who has picked up, I read your translation book years ago. I've not read your historicity book more recently. I don't follow these debates super closely, or these conversations super closely. I'm curious, that last slide was particularly interesting. You start with certain assumptions, and here's a list of things that it can demonstrate, but here's a list of things that are prohibited if you start with that assumption. How often in these conversations, whether we're talking about conversations or articles about academic articles about the Book of Mormon, how often do people keep those issues in mind, and how often do they flagrantly violate them? I mean, do you run into people who are trying to have it both ways, who are starting from their loose translation but also want to incorporate their Hebraisms? How big of a problem is that? I'm just curious. if people
Yeah.
don't want to be constrained in the way that you rightly suggest they should be?
I think the constraint, it isn't so much that I see people trying to play both sides of that fence as I do people who will only look at one side and ignore the other one and not make any sort of conciliation with this, with that information. So again, we've been, Skousen and Carmack are my foils for this discussion, but they're so interested in making sure that they have these proofs that there's only one part of their mindset and they're not looking at anything else. And basically what they're saying is, well, I can't explain this, therefore this is the only, the miracle happens here because I can't explain it. I can't see any other explanation. So we don't get any other explanation. Nobody else says anything. But yeah, in articles, unfortunately, what I do not see, and I wish I saw more often, is people in articles who would look at both sides of the issue and say, okay, here's how things will lay out if you choose one side or the other.
And by both sides, you mean start with one set of foundational assumptions about what translation is versus another set of foundational assumptions about when translation is loose versus tight, et cetera. That's what you mean.
You have to be able to say, okay, where am I being consistent?
Right.
And if you're going to say it's a tight translation, then you have to look at something else. I give you an example, and this isn't necessarily from translation, but I just recently read the book Visions in a Seer Stone. And the concept of that book is that Joseph Smith understood the preaching circuit and had experience with the people who were the preachers of the time and the way they gave their extemporaneous speeches. And he would use that methodology to construct what he did in the Book of Mormon. And so basically the idea is you would get an outline of what you thought you were going to say, and that would trigger you to be able to then produce the information on the fly. And that explains how Joseph Smith was able to tell this story without having something in front of him to read. It sounds really good. And then you get, okay, now what do you do with all of the Nephi and Sermon on the Mount chapters, which are large chapters that are copied. And not only copied, but in which you can tell that the person who was copying, working with them, was interacting with them, and in particular was paying attention to italicized words. I don't know anybody who's good enough extemporaneous speaker, regardless of how good their memory is to be able to reproduce Isaiah, that knows when they're reproducing oral Isaiah that they've hit an italicized word. So if you can't explain italicized words, then your concept isn't going to work. You've explained this, but you haven't explained that.
Right. Thanks.
Okay.
Will you be doing a review of that book?
Pardon me?
Will you be doing a review of Davis's book?
Yes, I will. I've been collecting information, trying to decide which way I want to go about it. Some of it I think depends on the nature of memory, so I've been brushing up on cognitive science of memory and transferal of memory from long-term to short-term, and how many, so I'm not quite ready, but I'm getting there. It will not be a glowing review. All right, and anything else? Okay, don't see anything on the list or in the chat. Nobody else seems to be asking questions. Turn the recording off.